that training hard is a good thing.
Mm.
You know, we need to train hard, and if you want to get to high level performances, there's no easy way to get there. You could be lucky once, but if you want to do it on a consistent basis, then you have to have consistency in your training.
Mm.
That doesn't mean that you train constantly and that you never rest, because you need the recovery periods to adapt. But training hard is the stimulus that actually allows you to get to those high performances. There's no easy way to get there.
Off of that, I feel as though one common mistake that there's two common mistakes. One I had was that it's all about the number. And that was the first thing you said in the lecture courses. Obviously, I saw you as kind of like the research guy. So I was coming into the course thinking this is going to be a numbers statistician thing. And the first thing you said is like, the most important thing is talking to the athlete and seeing how they feel and having an open dialogue, not just staring at your spreadsheet and changing the workout based on that. So I think that is very important for people to understand. But two is that I think the sport specific workload and also the general training workload are both equally valued here. And I think people here train smarter, train harder. They think play your sport more. They think just do more of the sport itself. And that's personally where I actually think we hit the wheels on some big speed bumps, because people just do the same thing over and over again, not realizing there's a lot of opportunity to build capacity and build workload without just throwing a baseball or without jumping or running or doing gymnastics.
The term I would use is local tissue capacity. So if we're in rehab, our emphasis is generally on local tissue capacity. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't do sport-specific capacity training, because if we don't do that and we heal the tissue, we rehab it really well with improved local tissue capacity, there's still a massive gap between what gets done in rehab and what needs to be done as part of the sport. So wherever possible, when you have someone in rehab, you want to be doing touches, reminders of general capacity or sport-specific capacity, along with your local tissue loading. That way, we start to bridge the gap between what happens in rehab and what needs to be done in peak performance.
Dive into that, Tim. Can you just briefly overview kind of what those concepts kind of allude to?
Yeah, I mean, look, the floor, the ceiling, and time. The floor and the ceiling, as you say, they're just concepts. But this whole conversation is around those concepts. So the floor is I call it the athlete's current capacity. Now that could be local tissue capacity, or it could be sport specific capacity. And then the ceiling is the capacity that is required when you have to go to the sport or the activity that you need to perform. And then obviously time is just the time that you have to get from point A to point B, to get from the floor to the ceiling and get your athletes there in one piece. And you're absolutely right. Our biggest enemy in sport, or in a lot of different environments, whether it be military or the arts, is time. We always want one more week, or we want just give me one more week with it, coach. And well, we can't have one more week because the Super Bowl is next week, and after that we don't have a game. So the idea there is how can we use that information to safely build our athletes to the ceiling. We want them to be able to perform the demands of the ceiling, at the ceiling, or if possible, even raise that ceiling, so they have a higher capacity. They're better able to cope with what the game throws at them. And what we know that when you ramp up loads really quickly, that the risk of injury goes up. That's a really common finding. But we've just put out some stuff recently. This year, it's come out that if you ramp up loads really quickly, it also decreases your performance potential. So your readiness to perform decreases. And funnily enough, when you can build to higher chronic loads are associated with better performance potential. So it's kind of flipping the script or changing the narrative from risk to resilience. That if you can build up safely, not only are you going to have your athletes, more of your athletes available to play, but when they do play or when they are training, they're going to be ready for it.
And I think we experienced it firsthand coming back from the initial COVID shutdown, in March, April, May, we used all kinds of different, papers. There was a paper on, I believe it was Achilles injuries in NFL, American football, coming back from a lockout that had happened in 2007 or 2008. And it showed this massive spike in Achilles injuries coming back from a lockout where the players weren't able to train as they normally do, and then they get thrown right into competition and boom. And we're kind of seeing that again in the NFL right now. If anyone's been paying attention to the injury rates, they're just crazy. I mean, my fantasy football team is out the window. Week 1, it was out the window basically. But anyway, yeah, exactly. The COVID reserve is real. But and we try to use those as education pieces for the club coaches in getting their athletes back. When they do get them back in the gym, there's going to be this temptation to just hammer down, because they're raring to go. They've been cooped up for a while. They haven't been able to train. The athletes are probably going to look fresh. They're going to be jumping super high, running fast because they're fresh. Like, especially in gymnastics, they haven't been. There's very little off season. As like in terms of in the traditional model of training, it's basically train all the time.
Yeah.
There's no rest period. So when you get that 2 months of pretty low training loads, sure, you're doing conditioning and you're doing your at-home stuff, but you're not, the grind of 4 or 5 hours, 6 days a week isn't there. So they come back and they're ready to go. Central nervous system wise, they're ready to go. So that's what the coaches see, and they're like, we went through. We actually used our workload stuff that we had been able to collect via questionnaires leading up to COVID and then at COVID, and then so we had sort of their previous ceiling, what they were doing to prepare for that national competition that would have happened in the end of March. And then what they were doing during the COVID shutdown and where those workloads were, somewhere in the 30% range overall of more general type training. And so we sort of tried our best to map out for each individual, how to get back to that upper level of training. What does a progressive, 8 to 12 week sort of ramp up look like? And we thought, we generally thought that it would be easy to follow because there was no competition planned, right? Like, there was nothing on the horizon. There was nothing at the 12-week mark. There was nothing at the 52-week mark, for that matter, actually scheduled. So we figured, and when I say we, it's, sort of the IST with the sport. But sure enough, the coaches get the athletes back. They're looking good. Workloads, go up exponentially in the first 2 weeks. And then, by 6 weeks into return to training, we've got 75% of the team is training at some sort of limited capacity. And that's where it gets, it really hits home that, there's something to that. Obviously, there's something to this spike in workload. And the education and delivery that we were able to do was not effective on the whole. So I think that was definitely a humbling experience, and something that I can hopefully learn from, and that we'll all learn from. Now we're in a lot of Canada, we're back to a shutdown situation. They've closed a lot of places again to try to put a kind of chokehold on the next wave or whatever. But so really hoping that we can get that message across again in a way that the coaches will really identify with and want to follow
all this stuff. And so, yeah. Tim, if you're recommending someone who is looking at these concepts of floors and ceilings, what do people start with in terms of trying to plan the next maybe year after 2021? Because I think gymnastics is going to make a dramatic overhaul in the way they approach workloads after the Tokyo Olympics. So I guess not just for gymnastics, but how do you start approaching what's my ceiling, what's my floor? How do you put some baselines around that, and how do you plan for that?
Well, in general, when I'm putting programs together, I look at 3 main things. I look at the demands of the activity, the demands of the sport. I look at the physical qualities that my athletes need to perform those demands. And then I just do a needs analysis with my individual athletes. By raising the physical qualities, it helps you perform the demands of the sport. Now, those demands of the sport are like a moving target too, because sports change their rules all the time, which changes the demands. So you've got to keep reevaluating the demands. But that's typically the process that I'd go through in terms of developing a program. But that's kind of short to medium term goals. I like to have a long term plan. Okay, let's have a look at a snapshot of the annual plan. What does that look like? Where is our emphasis of training going to be? Where are we going to develop strength or emphasize strength over aerobic, over speed? Where are we going to get our skill work in? Where are our major events that we need to make sure that we're really firing? And where are other activities that could be major events for that athlete's life? For example, exam periods where there's going to be academic stress. So are we factoring in that as well? The last point there is that you have to be quite adaptable with that plan, though, because we think that, yes, the training stress is going to be a really big rock in terms of producing some sort of adaptation. Without a doubt, that's going to be an important part of it. But adaptation is also going to be influenced by other factors like other stresses. So if you don't consider those other stresses at the start and then don't adjust your program when they inevitably come, life just throws different stresses at people. If you're just rigidly sticking to the plan, you're not really giving the athlete the best chance of a positive adaptation. So you're going to have to be
when you plan for the most demanding passage of play, do you sometimes plan for the most demanding passage of play like within like a single game or competition, or do you also plan for like the most demanding like training block they're going to have? Because in my world, when I was trying to apply those concepts, I was thinking about the local physiological things they need of max anaerobic power or whatever, like a very specific competitive event may be. But I'm also in my mind thinking about, well, they also have to tolerate 4.5 hour practices 5 days per week. And then they also have to tolerate a 5 to 7 day national training camp, which is pretty arduous. And then in the macro period, I think, most people are training for a regional or a national event, which is oftentimes 3 days of back-to-back competition. It's not always one single thing. So I don't know. I've never really asked that, but do you plan for the specific most demanding passages of play, like we talked about in rugby in your example, or is it also you're trying to think about globally? If it's a 3-day event, I have to get somebody ready for, do I have to prepare that as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of answers to this. Let's go to the first part in terms of preparing for, a big training camp. It's going to be a 7-day training camp where training loads are going to be much greater than anything they experience on an average week. What I'm hoping to prepare for there is to develop a large enough chronic load to allow them to deal with the inevitable spike that's going to come with that training camp. If we can't change the coach's view on what they need to fit into that training camp, then the spike is going to come. So it may be unrealistic if let's say we've got 10,000 units of load in the training camp and our average week is 4,000 units of load, it may be unrealistic to build an adequate chronic load to bridge the gap between where they are and where they need to be. So, the reality is we may never get to enough training on a week-to-week basis to do that. But what we try and focus on there is if we can get consistency in our training through developing our chronic load, we get consistency, and we're trying to expand the glass as much as possible so that our chronic load is expanding over time. It's not going to take days or weeks. It'll take months and probably years to expand that glass. But we're also developing physical qualities that put us in a better position to cope with that spike. And
Scott, what are your thoughts? What do you think in terms of where the sport is going and practically ways that we can give people advice?
So I think if you can gather, some really basic information around how much work the athlete's doing, how hard that is, how they're feeling, through questions or responses to questions like you've laid out, sleep, mood, wellness, energy levels, all those types of things. And then you can, at the very least, try to get some type of performance metric. I find really, really helpful to figure out what that is between those session RPEs, event-specific session RPEs, wellness questionnaires, trying to use, individual trends as the mark of, is it a high or low value? Because just like you guys are saying, athletes, you can have one athlete who's going to answer 3 out of 10 for everything, and that's baseline. You have another athlete that's 9 out of 10 for everything, and that's their baseline. So, a 10 is an incremental jump for that athlete, whereas like a 5 for the first athlete is actually a huge jump and is a really good day. If we're looking at, rating is from 1 to 10. So it's really important not to compare athletes to each other with that sort of stuff and compare their own trends and look for anomalies there. I think those are the key key factors. Really understanding how much impact or how many impacts. I think that maybe is what it ends up boiling down to. Number and intensity of impact, and how an athlete can deal with that. How you can build those slowly over a period of time to build up that tissue resilience and build up that sort of injury resilience factor, if that's a thing, to try to keep athletes healthy. Because of the other piece with gymnastics that you guys know is that athletes are lasting a lot longer in the sport, especially on the female side. Males, it had been for a while, but I'm currently dealing with a 25-year-old gymnast, and then the average of the Canadian team that'll probably go now, if I was to guess, it's going to be over 20, the average of the 4 or 5 gymnasts that go to Tokyo. And that's crazy compared to even 8 years ago. The average would have been 16, right? So that's where the sport's going. And, we're going to have to figure out ways to keep those athletes healthy so that they can actually compete and they can actually train on a regular basis without, 75% of their year being made up of rehab. Because that's how you're going to push the envelope on the events. You're going to push the difficulty when you can train them repeatedly without getting hurt. And I think these types of things that we're talking about here is a huge step in that direction of making that happen.